a professor of strategy at the HEC Business School here in Barcelona. And it's really a pleasure to be here at the third of our webinar series that we are broadcasting as part of something called Business Schools for Climate Leadership. This is a group of 8 leading business schools which have come together to address the challenge of climate change. We hope to open this up to more business schools in the future. We believe it's critically important to train present and future business leaders on the different things they need to think about as we move the world towards a more sustainable future. In this group, we have Cambridge Judge Business School, HEC Paris, IE Business School from Madrid, the International Institute for Management Development, which most of us know as IMD in Lausanne. We have the Said Business School, which is part of the University of Oxford, and of course, IAC Business School, which is where I work and where I'm broadcasting from today. One of the first things we did as a group is put together a toolkit. These are 8 different topics which we all think are important. And we're going to be launching that toolkit in a couple of weeks in Glasgow at COP26. This will be the 26th meeting of the parties to the UN's framework agreement on climate change. It's a big event, and all of us and perhaps everyone in the world is kind of looking for this event in terms of making further commitments to reduce carbon emissions around the world. Today, we're going to be talking about 2 related but different topics. One is the link between nature and climate change, and the other is the overall topic about how to reach net zero, how to decarbonize an organization, an industry, or even a country. I encourage all of you to ask questions. If you're on the Zoom link, please do it in the chat box, which is provided. If you're watching on one of the LinkedIn live feeds, and we have different ones from the different schools, so please, there's a place to do that. Also, we have people in the back office watching this. We have Marie-Pierre in Paris, and we have Jane and Eleanor in Cambridge, watching the chat. They will then be retyping your questions and making sure that I can get them here, because we really want to make sure we have some time to go through some of your questions. Now, we also know that most people have another call, another meeting, or something else to do at the top of the hour. So we're hoping to stop at 5 or 8 minutes before the top of the hour in order to give everybody a chance to do that. So please stay with us, because I think it's often the last couple of minutes of the session which are the most interesting. Now, today, let me just introduce our panel. We have Daniel Halbheer. Daniel is an associate professor at HEC in Paris. He's kind of in the marketing area, but I know him as a sustainability guy. So Daniel, welcome to the webinar. Jennifer Howard-Grenville is the Diageo Professor of Organizational Studies at the Judge Business School, which is at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for being with us, Jen. And last but not least, we also have a special guest today who is Igor Shislov. Igor is a senior consultant at a company called Perspectives. This is one of the top consulting firms in the world, which is helping governments and companies on the policy questions taken together in terms of sustainability. So welcome, everybody, and thanks for being with us today. If it's okay, I'll just go right into it, because we have a limited amount of time. And let me just start with you, Jen. How does climate change affect the natural world, and how does the natural world affect climate change?
Thanks, Mike. And that was a lovely introduction. And of course, as you point out, the relationship between climate change and nature goes both ways. So most obviously, climate change is affecting nature. We see dramatic evidence of that. For example, we see intense wildfires. We see floods that are affecting coastal ecosystems and habitats. But there's also many more subtle changes. And it's quite fascinating to see what biologists have uncovered in terms of genetic level changes in species that are adapting to changes in seasonality, for example. So the Arctic hare has adjusted its color of its coat based on the fact that winters are shorter. Migratory patterns are changing. And all of these are really important because nature has evolved over millions and millions of years to develop the ecosystems that we have now. And they're being thrust into a phase of unprecedentedly rapid change. So climate change is definitely affecting nature, but nature affects climate change. And I think as a little run up to COP22 has made evident, one of the key ways that we're going to tackle climate change is through nature-based solutions. And it's quite interesting to note that forests already remove about 25% of human-sourced carbon emissions. And there is the potential for about 1/4 of the cost-effective climate mitigation to come from protecting and restoring forests worldwide. So nature plays a huge role in our ability to tackle climate change. But as we see, because of this relationship that works both ways, the more we destroy nature, the more we undermine our capacity to take advantage of these nature-based solutions, which are not just out there, they're largely much lower in cost than many of the other solutions that we have on the table. So for example, the Amazon rainforest alone holds a decade's worth of human-sourced carbon emissions, or the equivalent of a decade's worth of human carbon emissions. It's an enormous sink for carbon, but we have already collectively destroyed about 20% of the Amazon. And as climate change occurs, the Amazon itself will be subject to more rapid destruction because of changes in rainfall patterns, because of intensification of wildfires. So we need to think very, very carefully about these interactions between nature and climate change and what they mean for the potential to address both climate change itself and nature positive agendas.
So Jen, you say we, and I get the sense you mean, civil society, the world, the planet, governments, et cetera. Why should business be interested in this topic?
Absolutely. Well, we should all be interested, but specifically business, because, business relies directly or indirectly on the fruits of nature every single day. So a significant portion of the world's economy is directly related to values that nature provides through, for example, what we call provisioning services. So these are the things that the foods, the fibers that we use in textiles, the timber that we use in building, all of these are sourced from nature. And so many, many companies in some way, shape, or form, either directly or through their supply chain, relies on what nature provides to us. Even more companies rely on what we call nature's regulatory services, which are often things that are unpriced in the market right now. So this includes clean water, this includes clean air, this includes flood protection for communities or around businesses. So again, the kinds of things that we're reading about daily in the newspapers are affecting businesses, not just those who produce in the agricultural sector and who rely directly on foods and fibers, for example, but every business, even businesses whose employees need to commute, need to live healthy, safe lives. As we undermine ecosystems, we really do undermine the ability for people to live and work and carry on in their typical ways. And so to undermine not just the threat, but the opportunity, the World Economic Forum has estimated that by 2030, there could be $10 trillion US of business value created by attending to some fundamental ways in which we can protect and restore nature, which includes looking at how we're deriving energy, how we're interacting with our infrastructure in the built environment, and of course, the food, land, and ocean use that we take part in.
Jen, maybe we'll get to that a little bit later, but would you say that maybe, in historical terms, business is taken for granted that we have this abundance of nature to enjoy? Is that?
Absolutely. As part of my work for this toolkit that we're launching, I had the opportunity to read the Dasgupta Review, which was produced by Sir Partha Dasgupta. He is an economist at the University of Cambridge, and he has done for nature what essentially the Stern report did for climate, which is basically point out the economic opportunity surrounding protecting biodiversity and nature. And very much there's a strong case made in that report and by others that we have not priced nature's assets. And it's time to start thinking about our natural world as an incredibly valuable asset upon which all life, and including business activity, resides.
Okay, thank you so much. Daniel, let me turn to you, because clearly part of restoring this balance is about this, we got to stop putting so much carbon in the atmosphere. Can you tell us a little bit about, when people talk about the race to zero, when they talk about getting to net zero, what do they mean? What's at the heart of this whole story?
I mean, first, maybe the thing is what you're asking, Mike, is are people talking about it? Yes, they're talking about it. And more than that, this United Nations-led campaign to achieve net zero for actors outside of government has become a major success. So in the last year, roughly 5,000 organizations started to commit. And, even, industry champions such as Microsoft, they strongly commit to going net zero. And in a nutshell, this initiative really means, going net zero by 250 at the latest, and reaching an intermediate target, which is halving the emissions by 2030. And what I really like about this initiative is something, there's a carbon thing that's on top of the agenda. So this is on the corporate item list, and it brings together a large number of actors that work towards this goal, outside of any government-related initiative. And what I really think is that this initiative provides participants with a toolkit, in a sense, like there's a strategic dimension to it, there's midterm and long-term goals, and then there's a tactical dimension, in a sense, like these people or these companies that can work out a verifiable plan to achieve the targets, and kind of, the spirit is commit and act. And I think this is great to improve the situation.
So Daniel, you talked about 5,000 companies kind of signing, or organizations, because I guess there's cities and governments and all kinds of different things. For an executive who may be not working for one of these organizations, how much, why should they get to know about this stuff? What, why should they be interested at all? Because, if the big boss isn't decided to do it, why should someone, one of the people watching the show, for example, why should they learn about this?
I think, it's because it's a complex journey to get to net zero, and just ignoring it is just not an option given the situation in the world today. And I think also because, even if you're a manager in any of the companies, you are not directly affected by decarbonization, the decarbonization process will fundamentally transform organizations and the corporate value chain. So really, I think what leaders need to know is kind of three things. And I think the first is, what are emissions? How to measure emissions? It may sound trivial.
Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 story.
Exactly. If you want to take action, you need to understand. And because you mentioned Scope 1, this is at the level of the firm. Scope 2 is basically where and how you procure your energy. And if you're an energy-intense business, like emissions from purchased energy is a large chunk of the, Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then there is also another thing, if you think vertical supply chains, you also have indirect emissions from upstream production, and then there are emissions from the consumption stage. So, if you sell a car, emissions created in the consumption stage, that's a large chunk of emissions. When you think life cycle emissions, each of these components matter. And that's really the thing, understanding the nature and the scope of the emission. That's ingredient one. And I think number two, and Jen was kind of pointing to it, there's a way to reduce emissions. And the first step is like, what I always tell people, get rid of waste. It's green cost cutting. That's for free, And in reality, sustainability is often expensive. So it kind of pushes up costs, because going greener means, putting extra effort in that dimension. And actually, the beautiful thing about sustainability is if your customers value greener products, there's a cost and a benefit to sustainability, which kind of brings you to an optimal level of decarbonization or emissions, which is kind of the same thing. And once you're in this kind of journey, you can ask yourself how to get to net zero. And that's this kind of question, how to get rid of the remaining emissions.
And the next question is how do you reduce? What does companies do? What are the triggers that they can do? What are the buckets of activity, if you will? Because it's nice to talk about, reducing my emissions by half or so. How do I do it? What do I do first?
The first thing is take action. That's the first step, and there is no way around it. And then again, as I said, you can measure, we agree, okay, we can do that. And reducing, we can do it, and you ask how to do it. And I think, there's at the level of the firm, there is a way of process reengineering. So you can think about, hey, how are my employees traveling for work? How do they commute to work? There's a question of green technology adoption. If you're saying the delivery business, if you're greening your car fleet, that has an impact on the overall emissions produced for providing your service. And now, as I said before, if you're an energy-intense business, if you substitute from brown energy to green energy, this has a huge impact on your final product carbon footprint. Say you're in computing and you're using energy from coal to provide these computing services. That's a different game than when you're using green energy.
And Daniel, I don't know if I told you this, but in our business school, we actually talked to our power company and switched to renewable energy, and it's not there's no incremental cost. it's actually the same price or cheaper than it was before.
You see, it depends on the nature, like at what time of the day people use energy, for what do they use it, I mean, there are all sorts of questions, but you're pointing to the right thing. Is first you can ask the question, how much does it cost? How much money can I save? That's green cost cutting. Maybe there is a green premium, which increases your cost, and then maybe you find some customers who are willing to pay for it. So that's kind of what I like about this, trading off cost and benefits in going or in reducing emissions. And then what you were saying, what are the possibilities to clean up the rest? That's the end of pipe approach, where you can either offset, the emissions using nature-based solution. And what Chen has said, there's a lot out in the nature that can absorb carbon. And then there are also technology-based solution, direct air capture and storage of carbon. And maybe we can talk later about it. But these are, the two kind of main tools. And just maybe to put some of it into perspective, I think it's important. I like the reducing approach. The offsetting approach is tricky in a sense, as I mentioned, it's an end of pipe approach. And in loose terms, producing the mess is separated from cleaning up the mess. So basically, if you're producing in Europe, it's kind of a different thing when you plant trees in Africa. So there's an issue, because you spoke about it earlier, Mike, there's geopolitics involved, there's fairness involved, there's ethical questions that leaders need to be able to answer when they provide offset programs. I think that's really key. And also because we were just talking about offsetting, it's a huge issue to ensure verifiability. There are providers that offer, verifiable carbon offsets, internationally established firm, but still as a consumer or a manager, you need to make sure that the carbon is actually offsets. That's one thing. And another thing is just a question of time horizon. The emissions occur today, and the question is, when are they offset? Tree planting is fantastic, but if it takes 25 years to offset the carbon of a flight today, that's just a difficult question to answer. And
Daniel, leaving offsets aside, I think you mentioned something about reducing the carbon footprint of specific products and services.
Yes.
Is there such a thing as a zero emission product or service? Is it? What does that mean?
That's an interesting question, and it depends how you define zero. That's what the thing is all about. Is it net zero, meaning you have emissions prior to offsetting, and when you have like one of these emission offsetting tools, you bring them down to zero, to net zero. And like when you think about, from a climate change perspective, it doesn't matter. Net zero is the same as zero. It's just it's an ethical question, or it's a question about.
From a product point of view, Daniel, what do you have to do? Do you have to make products lighter, smaller?
The thing is, if consumers demand greener products, or if regulators push for greener products, then you have to bring down the product carbon footprint by reducing emissions across the corporate value chain, either at the level of the firm, at the level of the inputs, or at the level of the vertical supply chain. There's nothing else you can do about it directly to reduce emissions. And then there's the other part of offsetting the emissions. And what I'm trying to emphasize here, and that's an important point, if you have a greener product because you design it in a new way, the problem is this product can be very successful in the market, meaning overall emissions go up. You have a smaller, emissions are.
I make something with a smaller footprint. I sell lots of them, and my footprint actually might go up because I was so successful.
Right, and that's actually where that's the tragedy. Sometimes it's called a rebound effect.
Okay.
And with carbon offsetting, you can clean up this mess. And as you were saying, is there something like a zero carbon product? Actually, people are working towards carbon negative products these days. That's the latest trend. And this is especially in material science, where firms try to inject, captured carbon into basically building materials or other things.
Cement, that's a big deal, yeah.
Yeah, so there are net zero carbon products.
My low carbon product instead of someone else's high carbon product, if I sell more, that's okay, because the planet's going to benefit anyway, right?
Right.
My carbon emissions will go up, but at least, the planetary emissions should go down, and I'll win market share. So it's still a win for me.
It is. Yeah, I was saying, as long as you can offset what you do, as long as the organization is at net zero, it's not a problem from a climate perspective. There are other issues related to that.
Got it. Let me ask the same question to Jen that I asked you, which is, what should business do with respect to nature? Because you say to me, respect nature. Yeah, okay. but where do I start?
Great question, Mike. And I think in many ways, as I alluded to earlier, our economic system, our business incentives are not created in a way that we can inherently respect nature because of the fact that many of the things that nature provides for us are unpriced in the market. But I think increasingly, companies are recognizing that both their long-term ability to stay in business and their orientation towards risk needs to start considering these issues very seriously. So I would say, first, do no harm. That phrase. Conservation ecologists tell us that the best thing to do with nature is to leave it in place. Leave intact ecosystems in place. It's much more effective in terms of their ability to restore themselves, to sequester carbon, to clean water, and to do the functions that they do if we leave them in place rather than destroy them and then restore them. Now, clearly, we have actually affected 75% of the land's surface, and so we have affected many, many ecosystems. But the hierarchy basically says, leave them in place, protect them, then restore as the next step in the hierarchy. But more specifically, there's three things that I go into in the chapter that companies really need to be looking at. So first off, as they're doing all of their important things towards decarbonization, as Danielle has alluded to, they need to also pay attention to interactions with nature. So for example, renewable energy, which we see a big push towards, does not come for free in terms of its impact on nature. We know that hydroelectric electricity has some very significant impacts on entire ecosystems and watersheds. Solar energy seems to be pretty benign in terms of its impact on nature, but you have to have carefully thought out, siting and provisioning. Wind power has some significant impacts potentially on migratory birds or bats. And so involving ecologists and involving people who take account of the impacts on the natural world is absolutely essential when one is thinking about responsible projects around renewables, not just in siting and establishing them, but throughout their life cycle. So that's a key thing that businesses need to ask. Are our renewable plans actually consistent with a nature positive agenda? The second thing they need to look at very carefully is our decision making taking account of risks associated with nature. And those aren't simply we may no longer have a supply chain for agricultural products, for example, but for any businesses, their consumers, their employees, they will be affected by not only the more extreme events we're seeing around climate change, but how those impact on nature and ecosystems. And so the task force for nature-based financial disclosures is something to keep a close eye on. It very closely mimics the task force for climate-based disclosures, and it's a few years behind, but it will be putting in place some frameworks that businesses should certainly become familiar with in looking at these nature-based risks. And finally, of course, we need to talk about carbon offsetting, as Daniel has already mentioned. And I think companies need to be really aware of the quality of offsets that they might use. Generally, it's felt that one should only resort to offsetting if it's really, really hard to abate or find an alternative to emitting those carbon-based emissions. There are some sectors that are going to be very, very hard to substitute. So for example, air travel, we're a long way from commercial electric aircraft. And so the rest of businesses should really focus on what they can do. As Daniel said, there are many, many actions that could be taken to decarbonize before resorting to carbon offsetting.
And I had some experience recently with the board of a company. They were talking about different offsets they could choose. Some were more expensive than others. Are the more expensive ones better necessarily?
Well, I think, I had a wonderful conversation in preparing for the chapter with two of our academic specialists in the plant sciences department here. And they will say that the best thing to do is what nature provides for free, which is healthy, robust, wild forest lands. So the purchase of offsets, though, is very much a market-driven thing. But I think in terms of businesses considering their use of offsets, the most important thing is to be very, very careful about the underlying value of those assets and how well they're being managed. So for example, about 45% of the forests that are now pledged for reforestation are being replanted as monocultures. And I think we all know that monocultures are not producing robust ecosystems.
They just put in pine or eucalyptus as far as the eye can see,
Yeah,
And it's different than a natural forest, which is different species and bushes and
very different. Yeah, very different. And one thing I learned that surprised me is, soils. It's not just the trees. Actually, soils might be sequestering as much as 40% of land-based carbon sequestration. So that's actually fascinating. We need healthy soils, and you don't produce a healthy ecosystem by monoculture planting. Amazingly, also wildfires, which we think of as sort of devastating and negative in terms of carbon sequestration, natural wildfires or well-managed wildfires in a well-managed forest will actually restore forests, not just so that the trees come back, but also the soil carbon and the potential for the carbon to absorb the soil is protected. So we need ecologists at the table when we're making these kind of decisions. So if you're looking at carbon offsetting purely from a cost point of view, buyer beware. So this summer we had some devastating wildfires in the American West. They were far more intense than they would have been in the absence of the dry conditions produced by climate change. And both Microsoft and BP had fairly low priced carbon credits held up in those forests. Now, well-managed carbon credit schemes always have a buffer in there to account for things like losses due to wildfire, but the losses are larger than we had designed for. And so thinking about, is this a well-managed carbon credit scheme, is not just about, does it appear to have adequate buffer capacity now, but what is going to happen over the next 30 years? And have we adequately accounted for that?
Okay, thanks so much. So, by the way, we're going to get to Igor in just a second. But if you do have questions, please type them into the chat, or if you're on the LinkedIn Live feeds, wherever you find, there's always a space. We have people looking out for your questions. Now, if I get the story right, we have nature, we have decarbonization. Companies should do all the things they can do. And then at the end, there's the question of offsetting. My guess, Igor, is that there's a policy framework discussion around here. There's something about, where is the regulator in all this? And is it something that each company can just do whatever they want? Or is there some kind of regulatory consensus, if I could use such a bold word, emerging around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be here. And well, let me start by stating the obvious. Climate change is clearly a market failure. The damage caused by emitting greenhouse gases to our society and to nature is not automatically priced by the market. The polluters do not pay for these costs, right? Now, any environmental economist will tell you that to fix a market failure, one needs a government intervention, and that's where the role of the government comes in. Because with all the best intentions, all the initiatives that are welcome, that businesses are taking, it is pretty obvious that the private sector will not solve the problem alone. And even if some companies voluntarily take action on climate, there will always be free riders. There will always be those willing to continue business as usual simply because there's an incentive to do so, right? Now, at the same time, we cannot solve the climate change problem without businesses. And that's why, in my view, the role of the governments is to provide a clear direction of where we're heading and a clear and stable, most importantly, policy framework and incentive structures to guide businesses towards decarbonization. Now, is this happening in practice? The answer is yes and no. On the one hand, there have been many important policy developments since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Governments of many industrialized countries and even some emerging economies increasingly set net zero targets for 2050, or in some cases even earlier. And in the run-up to COP26, which starts in less than 2 weeks in Glasgow, countries have submitted their enhanced climate plans for 2030. And this creates a momentum and gives an increasingly clear indication for businesses about where we're heading to. But on the other hand, we know that overall, the current policies and pledges are still not sufficient to limit global warming to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees.
Even with what we expect John Kerry and all these people to say in Glasgow.
Yes, Mike. Even with the updated climate pledges, and overall, what we see is that overall there's still lack of sufficiently ambitious incentive structures for businesses to decarbonize. But it's not all that grim. The situation is changing, and the time of free carbon emissions indeed will be over soon. More and more jurisdictions are introducing different carbon pricing instruments in the form of carbon taxes or cap and trade systems. The EU recently implemented important reforms to fix the European carbon market, which propelled prices to over 50 euros per ton of CO2. And this obviously has a material impact on businesses. And there are dozens of other examples of carbon pricing policies in both industrialized and emerging economies. For example, this year, China launched its own cap and trade system, which is actually now the largest carbon market in the world. But of course, carbon pricing is not a silver bullet solution, right? It's not a silver bullet policy, like many theoretical economists still believe. From my field experience working with the governments and with the private sector, it is quite clear that in practice, there are also many non-pricing barriers to decarbonization that require additional policies beyond carbon pricing, and governments should and are in fact implementing those complementary policies such as building codes, fuel standards, R&D support, energy efficiency, and of course policies to protect nature, as Jan was mentioning earlier.
Would I be right to say that Scandinavia might be ahead, Europe next in line? The US kind of got confused through the Trump administration, and the other countries are kind of following. Is that more or less the order in terms of who's pushing harder for this, or is there a different order?
Yeah, you can say that, Mike, but I think it's a bit more complex than that. We really have to look at different policies in different sectors. And we shouldn't forget also about what we call carbon leakage, where emissions are essentially, outsourced to countries with lax environmental regulations. But we do see that climate change is becoming a central issue for businesses and for the financial sector these days. In June this year, actually, the G7 governments agreed to make climate-related financial disclosures by TCFD mandatory. And the EU is launching the so-called green taxonomy that will hopefully help guide investors towards sustainable activities. Jan already mentioned the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which will hopefully help address some issues beyond climate and broader, environmental risks and opportunities.
It's all about putting an economic value on nature, I think, which is one of the questions we had.
Yeah, right. Well, as I said, it's not the silver bullet solution, but it's one of the important policy levers.
Igor, we've got lots of questions. If I could just start with you for the first question. I know you got more to say, but we'll bring you back in a minute. But I do want to get to 3 or 4 questions. Let me give you the first one, which is carbon taxes the silver bullet? This is from Anne Freisch from one of the HEC people. But a carbon tax, deal's done. People will build it into their prices and everything's good.
Great question. And indeed, that's what many people still believe. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. Carbon tax or a cap and trade system is indeed an important policy instrument. And it can work, especially in sectors where relative prices of products and fuels are involved. So, for example, when the price in the EU emissions trading scheme is sufficiently high, we can observe an immediate switch from coal to gas-fired power generation, which is less polluting, right? But then we have other sectors where we really need to think about more long-term transformations of infrastructures, or, for example, energy efficiency measures, that are economically attractive anyway, right? But they're still not happening because there are other barriers. There may be investment barriers, there may be lack of information. And that's why governments should put in place complementary policies to support this action. So carbon pricing is important, but it's definitely not a silver bullet solution.
Thank you. Now we have 3 or 4 kind of categories of questions, lots of questions, but there's kind of 3 or 4 categories. And this is to anybody who really wants it. Maybe we'll start with Daniel. Is a carbon-free supply chain really possible? Or is it just kind of a crazy dream?
I think the feasibility is hard to imagine today because a lot of stuff can change in the future. But I think thinking about emissions in a way to understand where they come from, what can be done in terms of optimization, and what is really an unavoidable residual, that's just something that, once you start to think about the problem this way, you can really maybe find a solution. But it's going to kind of zero, in a sense, like across the entire economy. It seems not to be feasible today, but I think it's not necessary. I think the best approach is to start where you can take action. And I think that's the most important. There are businesses that can go almost, zero by just improving things. And these are important, signals to the market, and others may follow. And as Igor was saying, the thing is, policy has a strong lever. And if policy interventions are there to limit carbon emissions, the firms have to act, whether it's, kind of hard limits or monetary, instruments. It doesn't matter. If needed, policy has the toolbox to limit carbon emissions, and firm will follow. There's no way around it.
Okay, Jen, you want to quickly have anything to add to that? Is it realistic someday?
Yeah, it's an intriguing question, isn't it? And I think that this kind of thinking is demanded, because the thinking that got us here won't get us out of this situation that we're all in. As an organizational scholar and specialist in organizations, I will say that we need to pay attention to behavioral change. So if we intend to produce all the same stuff that we now have and produce it for the rest of the world that doesn't necessarily consume the stuff that we do in the Western world, we're fooling ourselves, because a carbon-free system in which we consume and travel and do things in the same way that we're doing, and do them in increasingly in more intensive ways, just doesn't add up. I mean, textile production per capita has doubled since the 1970s, and I would argue we're not necessarily better clothed. So, we're just using more stuff. And I think, to Daniel's point, it will just become more and more impossible to decarbonize when we're using so much stuff. So the other side of me, however, is a recovering engineer. And I always tell people, you need to do the math. And so, to Daniel's point, and Mike, you pointed this out, it's supply chain issues. So paying attention to where will you get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of taking carbon out of the system. And it might be by replacing a product with a service. It might be by working really, really hard with your suppliers, because 90% of your carbon footprint actually lies outside your control. And that's the new kind of thinking that we need to adopt, rather than just let's create the perfect zero carbon product. That might have some marketing flash, but I think we need to be realistic here about the behavior and about doing the math.
All right, so we've got a bunch of different questions, just in the interest of time. Some are about startups and some are about legacy big companies. Maybe I'm going to combine all those questions together and just ask you to comment. What is the difference between enormous companies, medium-sized companies, and where do you see startups having a place to play in this whole transition? I don't know. Do you want to start with that, Daniel, and then go to Jen?
Again, I mean, and Igor was mentioning, there is no one-fits-all solution for no matter what the business is. And that's what I think is so important to understand. Each business has specifics, whether it's a startup or an established company. It's just maybe, you can say a startup is more agile, an established company. There are so many, it's hard to say which works better. But I think the analytical approach, and Jen was mentioning that too, you need to sit down and figure out where you can have a fast effect with kind of pretty low cost to start with, or even if it's high cost, but where can you be effective when you start doing things in a better way? I think that's key.
And Jen, you've written extensively about change management. Is it easier to change the behavior of a startup than a big old company?
Well, Mike, it's interesting, right? Because startups we think of as typically nimble, and a startup can be born green, as it were. It can have sustainability, not just environmental, but social sustainability at its heart. We're seeing many, many new forms arising that aren't just business forms to address, complex social and ecological issues, along with make money and offer products and services. So I think it's a really exciting time to look across all of these sort of elements of the ecosystem. No two organizations are the same. And I think what is actually really important, we might learn a little bit from nature about complementarity within ecosystems. So startups indeed can push big companies to be more nimble, to be more aggressive, to change their ways of doing things. They can set the bar, and consumers might respond and start asking more of the established incumbent companies. The other side of it, though, is incumbent companies can do a great deal at scale, and they already are. They're influencing our lives. They're deep in supply chains. They have large footprints. So we need all of the above. We need change across the board. But I think when we start to think not just about how will an individual organization change, but how does that ecosystem of organization, which includes small and medium-sized enterprise, social enterprises, startups, large incumbents, how do they all push each other, and how do we basically, you know, to use an analogy, sort of raise all boats together? I think that's a really important thing to consider, and I think it's happening.
And here's a couple of questions again, which I'm going to combine. You know, net is not the same as zero, and if we just reduce carbon but sell more stuff, we're not going to solve anything. Can you comment on kind of the difference between net and zero, and is carbon really the place we should focus our attention, or should it be more holistic or more broader, to say it a different way? I don't know, Jen or Daniel.
So I'll speak to this in the sense of, I think it brings us a little bit back to this carbon offsetting perspective from the point of view of nature. And it's absolutely true. You know, unfortunately, we don't have the option to take the net out of the equation. The urgency with which we need to act and the things we need to do will require both nature-based carbon sequestration and probably other forms of carbon sequestration. That's what we've done so far has brought us to this point where we need all of these solutions.
Taking carbon out of the air, one way or the other.
Yeah. And so, you know, engineered solutions for carbon capture and sequestration also exist. And frankly, we will need all of them, but we need to keep asking ourselves in the business community and ourselves as consumers and people who want responsible governments to sort of set the rules of the game. We need to keep asking ourselves what we're actually doing here. And if we're being fooled by the net and feeling like, you know, there's always a way to sort of sequester the other stuff and avoid the uncomfortable questions of consumption, and avoid the uncomfortable questions of, you know, how long is this actually taking, then we're fooling ourselves. Because at some point, you know, the planet, and we've already seen the planet, it cannot respond anymore. That we've sort of taken resilience out of the system, and we need to be respectful of that.
Okay, so we're kind of coming toward the end. This has been an amazing discussion. I just think it's such a privilege to be able to talk with, you know, smart people about important stuff. Maybe I can ask each one of you to kind of give us your thoughts as you put this whole thing together. And if I could start with you, Daniel, you know, where are we? What's most important? Difference between net and zero, whatever you want. But you know, how do you sum up this whole conversation about decarbonization, nature, and the importance of moving forward?
I think you just mentioned a word. I think, you know, like once you start to look at decarbonization in isolation, you're looking at one problem, which is an important problem. But then just think about greenhouse gases more broadly. There are other powerful greenhouse gases there in the equation. We didn't even talk about them. Maybe we captured them in like under the label of, you know, carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. But then there is the whole thing of environmental sustainability, which is much broader. And Jen was talking about it. And Igor, we see there are so many problems.
And social sustainability, because we can't leave the communities out of the story, right?
That's what I'm saying. So what we need is, I think Jen was mentioning organizational change. I think we also need change in business model. And I think we need to really switch from linear, make dispose models to more circular business models. And I think there it's another way of thinking about the problem. It's about reducing, you know, waste and stuff in the design stage to build better recyclable products. We need to talk about the reverse supply chains, how to get the products back to the firm. You know, Jen was saying we doubled the consumption of clothes. Most of the stuff is going to waste. So maybe there's ways to bring them back to the company. And then there's also, you know, when you talk or when you think in a circular way, you think about carbon footprints, maybe you could tackle those, but there's also waste footprints, and at the same time, resource footprints. And when you take it even one notch up, you really start to think about the ecological footprints of your business. And I think that's the mindset that is needed. And Igor was saying, you know, a carbon price doesn't fix the things. I tend to agree. Again, it's not a solution for everything, but once there is a price on items such as carbon, nature, businesses will respond tomorrow. And even if they don't respond, you know, tomorrow, once there is a price, if you think about the future by making investment decisions, you will be guided by this price. And I think once you have this mindset of being guided by monetary incentives, that's the language business understands, and that will guide your action.
Business understands money. Once you put a cost on things, they'll be able to respond. And Igor, when I introduced you, I forgot to mention that you're also a lecturer at HEC. So you kind of go back and forth between the policy sphere, the government sphere, the consulting sphere, and the academic sphere. How do you see all this coming together?
Sure. Well, let me just quickly rebound on what Daniel said regarding prices, carbon prices. I think that's absolutely true that the most important is maybe not even the carbon price today, but the price expectations, because that's what's driving investment decisions. And one notion that I think we haven't really touched upon is the notion of carbon lock-in. When we invest in carbon-intensive infrastructures today, we're locking it for 30, 40 years to come. And we cannot allow carbon offsets to sort of justify these kind of activities. And the recent IEA net zero report clearly shows that there is no more space for investing in new supply of fossil fuels. So we really have to keep it in mind. And from the business point of view, I think that really those companies, those businesses that manage to anticipate, rather than resist the transition, will probably be those that emerge, as winners in this new economy. But this will, of course, require them to honestly look at their businesses, as Daniel suggested, look at their GHG emissions, scope 1 to 3, and demonstrate, sufficient leadership to transform their own operations and also their supply chains. And that's another reason why you have to be really careful with offsetting. Make sure offsetting does not substitute your own climate action. Otherwise, your business may turn out to be obsolete very quickly. So yeah, I'll stop here, and best of luck to everyone on this net zero journey.
Thank you so much, Igor. Jen Howard-Grenville, how do you see all this coming together?
Yeah, I guess my key message to the business and finance community in thinking about these issues is climate change is complex enough, and climate change is extremely urgent. But the biodiversity challenge is also extremely urgent. Many of you may or may not know that we have 2 COPs going on right now, and the other COP is in Kunming, China, and it deals with the Convention on Biological Diversity. And increasingly, COP26 and COP15 on the Convention on Biological Diversity are coming together, and so we should too. We have one planet. Nature and climate change are intimately connected, and so as businesses are considering their climate actions, I'm afraid we need to make it even that little bit more complex and see if these actions are also nature positive and can be. There are many, many ways that we can have, quote, co-benefits by actively managing forest lands, for example, by actively managing nature, that will get us to, achieve both, mitigating climate change and also protecting nature. But to do it, businesses have to take the hard step of recognizing that there are many, many things that they need to understand. So get that climate scientist in the boardroom, get that ecologist in the boardroom, have them talk to each other, and inform yourselves about how to deal with these complex risks and vulnerabilities that we're all facing.
Jen, just a follow-up question on that. So again, if you don't understand how this whole thing works and what it's called, COP is the Conference of the Parties. So in 1992, the world more or less signed an agreement at the United Nations to tackle climate change. It took them a long time to get to COP21, the 21st meeting of that group, to agree on the Paris climate deal. And now we're on COP26, which is the 26th meeting of that group, spreading out over 30 some odd years. In the biodiversity space, it's COP15. So I guess that's the 15th meeting of that treaty. Have they gotten, or will they get to the equivalent of the Paris climate deal anytime soon?
Oh, that's way beyond me. And actually, don't even quote me on the 15. I'm going to have to look it up, but it is occurring right now in Kunming, China. And I think 2 of the things. One is there's a lot of urgency around setting a global goal for nature in much the same way the Paris Agreement brought us global, goals and commitments around net zero. And with climate, with nature, it's a little bit more complex because climate, you can emit a ton of CO2 in India and the equivalent warming effect of methane in Vietnam, and it's going to have the same effect on the atmosphere. With biodiversity, there's hotspots. So Mike, one of the goals that's being posited is 30 for 30. So let's protect the 30% of the earth that is most biodiverse and most important to us from that perspective by 2030. So we're moving. we're lagging, but we're moving in some commitments that hopefully will result in global commitments on nature.
I think this is critically important because, you know, the planet doesn't care where the carbon comes from or where it goes away from, as long as it goes away and doesn't come so much. But from a biodiversity point of view, you know, the ecosystem of the Amazon is different than the Pacific Northwest of the United States or the forests in Italy. They're all different places with all different kinds of things, different communities and different things going on. So I think that's a very important point. Well, let me just thank the panelists. This has been an amazing session. I really appreciate your candor and your flexibility answering the questions from our audience. Again, this is the third webinar of the series. We're doing these webinars from the Business Schools of Climate Leadership. We're doing this to give you a sense of what's in this thing we're going to call the toolkit. This is a series of different informations on all of these topics. This will be launched publicly at COP26, again in Glasgow in a couple of weeks. And you can see everything on the website, which I think is on the slide here. You can see all the different things that are happening. The next webinar will be our friends from Oxford and IMD, and they'll be talking about business transformation and managing climate risks. So really, really important, getting more into the kind of the hardcore issues inside the business, while today we've been talking a little bit about broader issues. I've got 8 minutes before the hour. I promised everybody to have a chance to grab a cup of coffee, check on the kids, and do whatever you have to do before you run to your next Zoom call or your next meeting or whatever else you have to do. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure moderating this fantastic discussion with our speakers, Igor, Daniel, and Jen. Thank you so much for your time today. And thanks, everyone, for watching.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.